Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 388 through 390, which will cover manga chapters 493 through 496. And yeah, we get to see the long-awaited reveal of who Duval actually is, as well as arriving at our next island, the Sabaody Archipelago. Also, I apologize, my voice may sound a little weird because I'm dealing with a bit of seasonal allergy, so I've been sneezing a lot. So, yeah, my voice is a little out of commission, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, synopsis. The Straw Hats continue to work their way to their next destination, the Sabaody Archipelago, but first need to finish their battle against Duval and his flying fish riders as they work to rescue Hachi, but soon are shocked to find out Duval's true identity. Alrighty, so differences. There are actually several differences in this set of episodes. So the first one, in the manga, when Luffy crashed into Duval's hut and saw his face, there's a moment where we see Duval put his mask back on and stands over Luffy angrily saying, "You saw." That moment is actually cut from the anime, and the scene just ends with only Luffy's reaction, and then the next time we see them, they're already outside. Why they decided to cut that, I'm not sure. Maybe for time. And it doesn't really change the overall dynamic of the scene, so I mean, it's fine that it was cut out. The next one is the hentai Frankie gag is a bit more involved in the anime, as Sanji and Usopp are seen yelling at Frankie, and they're not talking about, they're yelling at him the fact that the writers aren't talking about Frankie. This gag is a little bit more subtle in the manga and only secondarily shows Frankie reacting anytime somebody says hentai. Thirdly, we get to see Duval's backstory actually animated in the anime, whereas in the manga it's just one panel of him lifting up and threatening that man. And that's all we get. In story-wise, yeah, it's a little bit more exaggerated in the anime as well. Another change that they made is in the anime, they added Luffy shining after witnessing the Gaon cannon and Zoro having to shield his eyes, which I thought was a genius change. I love that change in the anime because it makes it even more absurd, Luffy's like intense emotional reaction to the cannon. And then at the start of episode 390, we see the reaction of Duval and the Flying Fish Riders' reactions to Duval's new beat-up face. But this is an anime-only scene, as we don't actually see Duval and the riders till much later in the takoyaki scene when they're already set sailed and they're enjoying their takoyaki. The manga just begins with the Straw Hats enjoying the takoyaki. And then finally, in the anime, it's Nami who mentions the coincidence that Fishman Island is the same distance, 10,000 meters, below as Skypiea was 10,000 meters above sea. But in the manga, it's actually Zoro who actually mentions this fact. And I'm not sure why the anime decided to change this. Maybe they figured it doesn't make sense for Zoro's character to remember like a detail like that. But I think it's kind of cool that it's Zoro who actually remembered this and not Nami. Anyways, that'll do it for the differences, so let's get into the episodes themselves. So picking up right where we left off, as the battle is about to commence, Luffy is enthralled by the flying fish bikes and steals one, riding around on it for a while, having the time of his life until they all decide to dive in the water, which is something we all knew was going to happen. But I love that we get a callback to Skypiea with a new layer added to it. And just like when Luffy got carried away trying out the waiver when they first met Konis, he almost drowns, and then Chopper goes in after him to try and save him, forgetting that he himself is also a devil fruit user and will drown. Well, here in this scene, Chopper again instinctively jumps in the water to rescue Luffy, but now Brook has joined him, but also Brook himself is a devil fruit user, so they both drown, and now all three of them need to be saved by Frankie and Nami. Which brings up a good point that the crew has many more devil fruit users now than ever with Brook now added. And so they'll definitely need to balance themselves a bit more out, like I mentioned with the submarine last podcast. Zoro on Luffy's orders frees Hachi, and Hachi quickly disposes of the macro pirates, basically Team Rocket style. Then we get another one of my personal favorite exchanges. Hachi is overjoyed and being back with Kami and Pup-Bug, but also very remorseful about what he did during their duel at Arlong Park. Hachi is all like, I caused you so much pain with the six sword style, and Zoro just claps back, I don't remember you ever landing a single blade on me. And he's right, none of Hachi's sword attacks ever actually hit Zoro, and the only actual blow that Hachi lands on him was the headbutt to his wounded chest, which to be fair looked like it hurt a lot at the time, but not one blade ever touches Zoro in that fight, and I had never noticed that until this scene where it's actually pointed out, at least when I first read it. One other thing I want to point out is, again, we see another example of Luffy's willingness to follow orders despite him being the captain. We see Sanji immediately order Luffy to go after the flying fish, while Sanji goes after the rider when the one guy is trying to do that zero fight kamikaze suicide attack thing. And then in another separate note, kind of building off of that short filler episode where Brook is a little insecure of his place on the crew, feeling ashamed that in his first battle he nearly drowns, he decides to showcase what he brings to the fight by doing some pretty awesome things like his insane mobility, like super jumping and water running like we've already seen. But it's now revealed that he can manipulate people using his music by putting them to sleep, which is something I didn't think he'd have, but it makes perfect sense. Although what doesn't make sense is how he's able to play his violin with his sword. That's literally just metal on metal and probably would result in mostly just scraping noises. And, in a small callback similar to Django's hypnosis, all the way back in Syrup Village, Luffy also inadvertently is susceptible to sleep via the song that Brook plays, as well as Chopper this time. Luffy eventually finds his way back on a flying fish bike, but makes the poor choice of picking one with a passed out rider and crashes into none other than Duval's hut, where Luffy gets to see Duval's face, but we don't get to see it yet. All we get to see is Luffy's shocked reaction, which fueled even more speculation at the time among the fandom as to who Duval could possibly be. And I remember people going nuts with their theories about who this could be, from things like the aforementioned Don Krieg to the mountain bandit Higuma from the very first chapter. I mean, it was, and just a bunch of other crazy ones too. But yeah, meanwhile, we do see a brief scene of Zoro struggling as his body has not yet recovered from all that damage from Kuma, which Brook explicitly shows concern for. And in a reverse callback to Arlong Park, the last time we saw Zoro struggling from a past fight when he was fighting this very Hachi, we get a split-second fake-out very reminiscent of that fight where Hachi looks like he's charging a weakened Zoro, but instead, this time he attacks to protect Zoro from an incoming attack. Before moving on, I gotta highlight the random hentai Frankie joke here. Obviously, this joke doesn't translate well here, but I like how randomly Oda never misses an opportunity to do wordplay with the word hentai or pervert with Frankie. So, in this situation, the Flying Fish Riders use the word hentai to communicate that they want to use a new aerial formation. But of course, hentai in Japanese means pervert, as we know. But the funny thing is how subtle this joke is, with Frankie's ears just perking up every time. And every time he hears the word hentai. And in the manga, it's even more subtle, as he just kind of is shown going, huh? And looks up. It doesn't even explicitly make the connection for you with the big labels like the anime does. Luffy and Duval finally make their reappearance. This time, Duval is on a giant bull, which I love, that Usopp immediately points out that Duval trampled his own house to make a grand entrance. But we'll finally get to Duval's true motivation for his hatred of the Straw Hats. And it's not actually Luffy, but shockingly, it's Sanji. But Sanji has no idea who this guy is or what he did to piss this guy off so much. But we won't have to wait too long to understand what Duval is all about. And this moment was so freaking amazing and hilarious and shocking all at the same time. As we see Duval's face is that weird-ass, absurdly misshapen wanted poster that was created for Sanji. Like, I swear to God, I laughed for a good 5 minutes upon first reading this. No one could have possibly predicted this. I certainly didn't even remotely come to that conclusion. And it's just another example of Oda being an absolute comical genius and the master of the long setup and payoff. It's still one of my favorite reveals and payoffs to a joke ever. And it's not even just the face and the reveal that's so funny, but it's the reaction of everyone too. You get to see a bit of shock and surprise from people, but then also pity from Frankie to the absolute rage that Sanji displays as a result of how utterly stupid this whole thing has been blown out of proportion. And his anger is also being fueled by the fact that he absolutely hates that wanted poster to begin with, since it does him no favors in terms of his reputation. Hachi and Zoro saying the two look exactly the same, pissing Sanji off even more. And not to mention Brook just laughing his ass off is amazing. But then there's Luffy's response. The way he just casually says to Sanji, like, it's just some neighbors squabbling over trash bins or something. He's like, all right, Sanji, we're just going to head out now. As if it's just any run-of-the-mill personal matter that he's responsible for taking care of by himself. And I don't know, there's just something about this moment that always kind of awed me about Oda's writing. Like, this moment of all moments, like, but just at how he was able to turn something so insignificant about a joke wanted poster and turn it into one of the most enjoyable and memorable reveals in this series, and completely subvert all expectations in a way that's surprising yet satisfying. It's just done so well, especially the way it plays with you when the poster was first introduced. Like I mentioned in earlier podcasts, at the end of Water 7, it kind of gives this sort of air of like sinister mystery as to like what could have happened in universe and out of universe to make Oda not want to go the normal route with the poster. There's got to be some reason to why Sanji is left all mysterious. But no, it's just a dumb joke. And yeah, you're left wondering why Oda did this. What could this mean about Sanji and his bounty? Is there a deeper meaning or maybe an in-universe conspiracy with Sanji? So many big ideas are floating in the minds of fans instead of getting anything dramatic, with which Oda also plays up heavily to mess with us during this whole build-up with Duval. We get a hilarious joke that actually leads to something meaningful and important, as we will see. But enough of me gushing over this moment, let's get back to the story. And then next, like, I could barely contain my laughing, but when Sanji ferociously yells, "Are you an idiot? First off, you can at least change your hairstyle or facial hair at the very least." You'd think Duval would react like most villains and yell back, "Shut up," or "I don't want to hear any of your crap." Instead, after taking a beat to angrily think about it, he then just turns to the camera and says, "You're right." And this is kind of the moment where I start to realize maybe Duval is not the fearsome villain that he is set up to be. And Duval then launches into what's portrayed as sort of a sympathetic sob story, but in reality, the tone of the story and what's actually being told does not mesh at all. He's telling a story as if he was just some innocent bystander that got wrapped up into some terrible misunderstanding, but he was not even remotely a good person to begin with, as he was a small-time mafia shaking people down for petty cash. But still angry, Duval has his men drag Sanji underwater to drown him, and here we learn something about mermaids, at least in something new, and they are in fact one of the fastest swimmers in the world of One Piece, which will probably be called back on later at some point. Kami goes into the water to save Sanji, but before we can even see the result of that rescue, now the Sunny is in trouble with a giant anchor threatening to be dropped on it and surely decimating it, but we get to learn a few more features that the Thousand Sunny has up its sleeve. First, it's probably the only pirate ship that can travel backwards in an instant with its appropriately and hilariously named maneuver, Chicken Voyage. It spins its figurehead lion's mane like a propeller, propelling it backwards, but the coolest thing about it is about to be revealed, as there's a compartment hidden in the bow of the boat behind the figurehead where we see that there is a front cannon that pops out of the Sunny's mouth, which is so freaking awesome. Of course, as their marksman, Frankie has Usopp man the cannon, and I also love how he compliments Usopp later for his skills with the cannon on his first try. Now, powered by Cola, of course, with everything Frankie, it fires an immensely concentrated burst of air, similar to Frankie's coup d'etat attack, but on a gigantic scale, to the point where it looks more like an energy beam, like a Kamehameha. And this thing absolutely obliterates most of the Flying Fish Riders, as well as half of Duval's base, dubbing it the Gaon Cannon. And you might be wondering why it's called that. Well, in Japanese, the onomatopoeia sound for a lion's roar is Gao. So the cannon is literally just called the Roar Cannon. And the best part, and another moment I busted up laughing when I first read this, and even more when I saw this in the anime for the first time, is Luffy's reaction to this thing. He's so overcome with joy that he's sparkling with tears pouring out of his eyes. But the thing that set me over the edge is Zoro's reaction is, "You're too moved," or "Kando sugida." And the nice touch in the anime, like I mentioned in the differences, is that they added the effect of not only his eyes being sparkly, but his entire body being so bright that Zoro has to shield his eyes from how brightly Luffy is shining. And yeah, I love that touch, and I love it when the anime does things like this. And oh god, I love this joke so much. It's been a while since we've seen these sort of absurdist type jokes, and I love it when they insert these in there. Now, during all this, Kami does save Sanji, but at first freaks out that Sanji is covered in blood, but he's just got a bad case of the nosebleeds due to being pressed up against Kami's boobs, which is appropriately responded to everyone with exasperation. And this moment, pay attention to this moment, because this little thing actually does come back as a callback later on. But anyways, Duval, backed into a corner, decides to attack using his giant bull thing called the Motobolo. And we get yet another joke that had me in stitches, where Duval plays up the threat of the Motobolo's horns, even going as far as to boast that they're called the heart-smashing horns. But when it does actually go to attack, it just uses a normal headbutt, which Luffy obviously stops with ease. But the best part is Chopper's reaction of utter shock and bewilderment, as it doesn't even freaking use the damn horns, and Chopper just randomly yells out, "The horns didn't even matter!" Oh man. And this is another moment where I think the anime plays it better, because in the manga, you see both things happen, and Chopper's just kind of in the corner saying this, which is funny. But in the anime, because you can see the attack first and then Chopper's reaction, I think the timing hits a lot better, and it's a lot funnier in the anime. But then something pretty special happens here, as Luffy does something amazing, calling all the way back to chapter 1 or episode 4 with Shanks. Luffy just seemingly scares his Motobolo, and then makes it pass out with just his presence and intensity, calling back to what Shanks did on a larger scale to the Sea King to save Luffy when he was a kid. And this is huge. Like, I know me and my friends all collectively shit our pants, because seemingly out of nowhere, Luffy is now starting to develop that crazy ability that Shanks had, where he can intimidate things just with his willpower or a spirit or something. And just indicated to us that Luffy is another step closer to reaching Shanks. And we all started to wonder what this will mean for Luffy's combat ability and strength. And I won't spoil anything, but you have no idea where this will lead to. The episode ends with Sanji returning to his senses and beating the ever-living crap out of Duval. But pay attention to what move he finishes Duval off with, the barrage shot. And that's all I'll say about that, as we'll see in the next episode 390 what that results in. We fast forward in time a tiny bit to where they're now back sailing and enjoying Hachi's famous takoyaki, and there's a nice scene where Hachi asks Nami what she thinks of the takoyaki, and at first it seems Nami is still holding a bit of a grudge, saying, "You think this is gonna make me forgive you?" And Hachi kind of panics and says no, with the trio of Usopp, Sanji, and Luffy all kind of tense in the background or underneath and concerned about the situation. Then Nami kind of smiles and says, "It's really good," and lets all the tension out of the air. And I just love this moment, showing just how much the crew cares about Nami's feelings and worries for her, especially the ones that firsthand saw what Arlong and Hachi were doing to her. And it's so sweet. Like, I love that. But also, I love that we get to see the depths of how good Nami's heart is. Despite how angry or heartlessly greedy she can sometimes get about money, she is an incredibly kind and compassionate person, willing to forgive. And I'm sure a lot of that can come down to the amazing woman that raised her in Bellemare, who herself was kind of a punk kid that seemed to have caused a lot of trouble in her youth, but somehow turned it around and became an incredible person herself. And I always thought of it as Nami believing that many people deserve a second chance no matter how hopeless they may have seemed. I mean, Nami herself was kind of a thief and a criminal, growing up, and she became a great person as well with a second lease on life. Something else I think that Nami, you know, and the rest of the crew have also seen on their journey, and this is more pure speculation and more, and also my interpretation, but the fact that they've met many people who have started off as villains or have seemed like they've done evil things may have had their reasons, but deep down they're a good person. Like when they initially met Vivi or Robin, this seemed to come up quite a bit with those two especially. Also in general, Nami just seems like a deeply compassionate and forgiving person unless you've done a few particularly bad things like harm or nakama, or we will go on to see another very specific thing that Nami doesn't tolerate much later in the series. But I think, apart from these two things, this may also stem from experiences with Bellemere. And again, this part is just purely my own interpretation. But Nami herself has done some fairly questionable things. And I think one of the last things that Nami did before Bellemere died was say something so terrible to her mom that she wished she'd been born to a rich family, which she immediately knew was the most terrible and unforgivable thing that she could have possibly said to her in that moment. But even after all that, Bellemere, even at the cost of her own life, forgave Nami and doubled down on her love for Nami and Nojiko. And I'm sure the horrors of that day are still seared into her memory, but also the love and forgiveness that she was shown by Bellemere is still there, if not more so to this day. And I think that stands more, especially symbolically, when she replaced the Arlong tattoo with the pinwheel and tangerine tattoo, kind of covering all of that. And yeah, I like how this all kind of comes full circle. Anyways, it's not long before Duval and the writers show back up with a complete change of heart, as Duval is now all handsome looking thanks to Sanji's Parage shot, as I mentioned earlier. First off, this whole character and story thread is just crazy random and off the wall, but I don't even care because of how damn funny it is. Also, I never imagined that the Parage shot is designed to alter a person's appearance. This raises so many questions now, because at first when he used it on Wanze on the train, I thought it was just a weird one-time joke written specifically for Wanze because of how absurdly stupid looking he was. But now it turns out that Sanji just has the ability to do this. First off, why does he have something like this in his arsenal? How does this even work? And there's so many other questions that I just don't understand about this this gag or this particular move that he does. But we could always go into that, but I'll just kind of leave it at that. But anyways, Duval is now forever indebted to Sanji and the Straw Hats, going so far as to call him young master like a Yakuza gang. But honestly, from this point on, Duval becomes an incredibly dumb but charming character. I especially love the little running joke of how he can't wink worth a damn and looks like he's about to shit his pants anytime he tries to. And this entire interaction with Duval and the various Straw Hats had me in stitches, especially the part where Usopp calls him stupid, but then Duval turns it around saying Usopp is jealous of him, and Luffy trying to hold Usopp back, saying he's not going to win this emotional fight. Oh man, it's just so funny. Once Duval leaves, we finally get to learn how to get to Fishman Island, as well as how to cross the Red Line into the New World. One way, which is the safer way, is to cross the Red Line through Marijua, or the other way is to deep dive into the ocean and go under the Red Line through Fishman Island. It's also mentioned that Fishman Island is 10,000 meters below the surface, which is an interesting parallel to Skypiea, which was 10,000 meters above the sea. But it's not long before they finally reach their next destination, the Sabaody Archipelago, described as a grouping of trees rather than an actual island in the form of a mangrove forest, which often can be seen with their tangled and densely tangled together roots. And they kind of conglomerate together to form an archipelago. All right, so here we're going to start getting into the nitty-gritty of like words and semantics and etymology. So the other thing I wanted to discuss was the name of the archipelago itself, because for years this had actually kind of confused me, not confused me, but kind of interested me for a while, and I never really bothered to look at it. So I actually did some research for this episode because it was personally curious to me, but I also wanted to describe it in this podcast. But first off, There's been a lot of confusion and debate surrounding how to actually pronounce this in English, and I always pronounce it Sabaody. And I know there's a lot of people that emphasize the O, so they call it Sabaody. But seeing as how the etymology of this word seems to come from the Portuguese word sabão, which means soap, and listening to this word said in Portuguese, it does sound like the O is less emphasized when saying it, so I'm sticking with Sabaody. Another thing you might notice if you listen to this word being spoken in the Japanese language, they're calling it shabondi, which is similar but definitely different. So what gives? Well, in Japanese, the word for bubbles is shabondama. Now, this is where things get very interesting and a little complicated based on my very limited research. And bear in mind, I'm not like a linguist or etymologist or anything like that, but I'll give it my best try. So based on my limited research, all these words can seem to be traced back to the old Spanish word for soap, which is sabon with an X. And it seems the Portuguese sabo, and the Japanese word sabon, and the modern Spanish word jabon all stem from the old Spanish word of sabon with the X meaning soap. Granted, in Japanese, sabon is only used in the context of soap bubbles. Hence, it's always paired with the word dama, which is the suffix version of tama, or ball. Hence, when you add the word tama after the word sabon, you get the word tama with a D sound, becoming shabondama, which is soap ball or soap bubbles. So now you can kind of understand why it's called shabondi, as this place's entire identity and culture stems from the prominent bubbles that can be seen all over the place. Now, the question of why Oda decided to have two entirely separate namings for this island based on the language, I'm not so sure why. For a while before more official translations were made available, I remember there was much confusion over how this place and this arc should be referred to in English, but eventually Sabaody was officially named in English and Shabondi is the official name in Japanese. And contrary to some people's misconception, Sabaody was not a mistaken translation made by the American publishers Viz. So that was always correct. And I know you might be tired of the language lesson, but by this point, there's another translator's note here about the wordplay used here to describe mangroves by Hachi. So later, when they're kind of like sailing through Sabaody, in the English subs, he refers to these world's largest mangroves as the hustle muscle mangroves, which is perfectly fine and pretty much works as wordplay in English. But there's a ton. There's also, of course, a lot of Oda's cheeky wordplay here lost. In Japanese, the hustle muscle mangroves are called the Yaruki-man mangrove. So the phrase Yaruki-man is what you use to describe someone or yourself. How we in English have the term, kind of like the phrase chomping at the bit, or basically how you describe someone that's very willing and excited to do something. So he mashes the two things together and turns the second man in Yaruki-man into mangroves, because mangrove in Japanese, they sound very similar, but it doesn't end there. So the word for tree in Japanese is ki. So the word yaru is to do something, but depending on the context of the word, yaru can also describe someone or something that is very capable. So the word yaruki normally means willingness to do something, but Oda uses this as a double meaning wordplay to say yaruki or exceptionally capable tree to bring the whole thing for full circle into the meaning of a mangrove full of very capable trees, which perfectly describes a mangrove forest full of trees that grow to the largest sizes in the world of One Piece. That was a mouthful. And then this whole thing also goes to explain the stuff that Luffy says after about the trees having hustle, and that he also has it too, which actually isn't too far off from the intended meaning. So I actually give the localization team a plus for this effort, because I think, it does capture it quite well, despite how difficult that wordplay is to translate from Japanese to English. Whew, that was a lot to describe. But anyways, then we get a pretty extensive amount of exposition and world building surrounding Sabaody. And by the way, occasionally I might accidentally call it Shabondi, because in my head, I almost always call it Shabondi, and really only use Sabaody when talking about it in English to somebody. So just fair warning there. Anywho, Sabaody is a crazy arc filled with some insane story developments as well as a crap ton of world building that will set up some of the more global story-wide threads that run through the rest of the series. The big one being the introduction of the world nobles, the people that actually live up in Marijua, that essentially control the world government and the Marines who serve them. Hachi immediately makes it very clear never to go up against the world nobles no matter what happens, even if there are people killed in front of them. They have to pretend that they don't see anything. And this is an incredibly ominous warning from Hachi. The amount of fear and sternness in the way he repeats this is very eye-opening. He's essentially saying that these guys can do whatever they want, even to the point where they can commit murder out in the open and everyone just has to pretend like nothing is happening, which is an insane amount of power and influence that they wield. But trust me, this isn't even half of what the world nobles are capable of, as we will see in the next few episodes, as well as the rest of the series. But yeah, I've got to say that though these episodes are filled to the brim with some really cool stuff like the Sunny's new capabilities, as well as Luffy's displaying that same intimidation thingy that Shanks has, and it has some of the most hilarious and memorable jokes. These episodes are pretty fun, but they don't really do too much to progress the story along too much. But nonetheless, I really enjoyed them. But yeah, if you did enjoy this, send me a like or a comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram and Twitter accounts at SunnyGo Podcast for updates of when I post new episodes or see some pictures of my manga collection. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. There will be a spoiler section following this, so if you're interested, stay on for that. But if not, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye. Alrighty, so spoiler section. Just a few things that I wanted to kind of talk about in this one. The biggest one being basically the first, well, I guess it is the first moment that Luffy actually displays Conqueror's Haki when he first uses it on the Motobolo. Obviously, at the time when this happened, we didn't quite know that it was Haki or Conqueror's Haki. All we knew was that it was very similar to the thing that Shanks did to that Sea King to save Luffy when he was a kid. And we will go on to learn what this actually is, obviously in Amazon Lily. And then he'll further develop this a little bit more throughout Marineford. And then of course, through the time skip, he learns how to master this a little bit more. I guess not master it, but kind of learn to wield it. He'll eventually go on to master it later on in Wano. But yeah, this was the very first instance of Luffy using Conqueror's Haki, which was really cool to see. The next thing I kind of wanted to talk about is Sanji. And yeah, Sanji, his wanted poster, obviously I kind of made it seem like that this was more just a joke, but Oda actually did have something more up his sleeve with Sanji's wanted posters. And not just this one, but all the other ones. Because obviously the next one that comes out is a picture of Sanji, but it instead only says only alive. Because Oda is trying to keep Sanji's sort of identity secret until it doesn't need to be secret, because he doesn't want to create that situation where Judge knows that Sanji is alive. And so finally, when Oda is ready to reveal to the world and to Judge that Sanji is fine and where he is, then he releases the picture. So I think this created a double use for the fact that it was a nice joke with Duval, but also it helped in keeping Sanji's identity secret. Although I don't know how you could really see like that picture and the name Sanji and not put two and two together. So I always found that a little strange. But I also like the parallels of Duval because of the Sanji name and the wanted poster. He had to basically put on an iron mask, but we learn much later on in Whole Cake Island that Sanji because Judge was so ashamed of how Sanji turned out, he puts him in an iron mask, and it's interesting how that parallels between the two of them. I don't know how. I don't really have like a thematic, deep, sort of layered explanation for that, but it's just an interesting parallel between the two. And then finally, the other foreshadowing that we get with Sanji are the nosebleeds especially when it comes to mermaids. And so, we get to see that. Obviously, this becomes a huge plot point in the Fishman Island arc, which I've mentioned in the past that I've hated this sort of character trait and story thread. But yeah, this is kind of like the beginnings of that. Anyways, that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. But yeah, hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you on the next episode. See ya.